Peter Pan by Sir James Matthew Barrie, 1st Baronet. Originally written in 1904. All children except one grow up. They soon know that they will grow up. The way Wendy knew was this. One day when she was 2 years old, she picked a flower and ran with it to her mother. I suppose she must have looked quite pretty, because Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you stay like this forever?" That was all that passed between them on the subject. But from then on, Wendy knew that she must grow up. You always know after you are 2 years old, for 2 is the end of being a very young child. Of course, they lived at number 14, and of course, Wendy and her brothers, John and Michael, had a nurse. But as they were poor and the Darlings could not afford a real nurse, their nurse was a large, prim Newfoundland dog they called Nana. Nana proved to be a very good nurse. It was a lesson in good manners to see her walking the children to school. She trotted quietly by their side when they were good, and butted them back into line if they strayed. Of course, her bed was in the nursery. How careful she was at bath time. She woke up at any time of the night if one of the children made the slightest cry. No nursery could possibly have been run better. And every night, there were lovely dances there. All of the Darlings would join in. The joy of those romps! The children would be very nice to their father, and Mrs. Darling would twirl so charmingly. There never was a simpler, happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter when she was cleaning up the children's minds. You see, every night, all good mothers rummage in their children's minds after the children are asleep, putting things straight for the next morning. That's why, when you wake up, your prettier thoughts are nicely aired and spread out, waiting for you to put them on for the new day. I don't know if you have ever seen a map of a child's mind, but what you see is the Neverland. There are zigzag lines, which are roads. There may be a forest with a beautiful lagoon beyond. There's space for lots of adventures. Often, it's full of make-believe. Of course, the Neverlands vary a great deal. John's, for instance, had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it. Michael, who is still very small, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. Wendy had a pet wolf, given up by its parents. On these magic shores, children are at play always. We too have been there. We adults can still think of how it was, though we shall land there no more. In her travels through her children's minds, Mrs. Darling found the most confusing name, Peter. She knew of no Peter, yet he was here and there in John and Michael's minds. Wendy's was filled with him. His name stood out in bold letters. As Mrs. Darling gazed, she felt that it had an oddly familiar look. When Wendy's mother asked her, Wendy said simply, "He is Peter Pan, you know, Mother." At first, Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she remembered a Peter Pan who was said to live with the fairies. The next night, when the children were once more in bed, Mrs. Darling sat down by the fire to sew. Then her head nodded, and she fell asleep. While she was dreaming, the window of the nursery blew open, and a boy dropped on the floor. With him was a strange light that darted around the room like a living thing. It must have been this light that awakened Mrs. Darling. She started up with a cry, and somehow she knew at once that he was Peter Pan. He was a lovely boy, dressed in shining leaves and the sap that seeps out of trees. But the most charming thing about him was that he had all of his first teeth. When he saw that she was a grown-up, he gnashed those pearl-like teeth at her. Mrs. Darling screamed. The door opened and Nana ran in. She growled and sprang at the boy, who leapt lightly through the window. Again Mrs. Darling screamed, this time in fear. She thought he was killed. She ran down into the street to look for his little body, but it wasn't there. Then she looked up, and in the black night she could see nothing but what she thought was a shooting star. Mrs. Darling returned to the nursery and found Nana with something in her mouth. It proved to be the boy's shadow. As he leapt at the window, Nana had closed it quickly. It was too late to catch him, but his shadow had no time to get out. Slam went the window, and snapped it off. Nana wanted to hang the shadow out the window, thinking, Peter is sure to come back for it. Let's put it where he can get it easily without waking the children. However, Mrs. Darling could not leave it there. It looked so messy. She wanted to show it to Mr. Darling, but he was thinking about something else. Mr. Darling wore a wet towel around his head to keep his brain clear. Besides, she thought he would only say, It all comes of having a dog for a nurse." So Mrs. Darling rolled the shadow up. She put it away carefully in a drawer until a better chance came for telling him. The chance came a week later, on a never-to-be-forgotten Friday. At first, Mr. Darling did not believe the story, but he changed his mind when Mrs. Darling showed him the shadow. Mr. Darling thought it a mistake to have a dog for a nurse. He worried that Nana looked upon the children as puppies. That night he said, "I refuse to allow that dog to be in charge of my nursery for an hour longer." He pulled Nana from the nursery and tied her up in the backyard. She barked and barked. That night, Mr. and Mrs. Darling went out to dinner at number 27. They walked carefully over the snowy streets while the stars watched. The littlest stars are full of fun, and this night they were waiting to get the grown-ups out of the way. As soon as the Darlings entered number 27, the smallest star in the Milky Way screamed out, "Now, Peter!" A moment later, a light fluttered into the children's room. The light darted into all of the drawers, looking for Peter's shadow. When it came to rest for a second, you saw that it was a fairy, no bigger than your hand. It was a fairy called Tinker Bell, wearing shiny skeleton leaves. Just then the window was blown open by the breathing of the little stars, and Peter dropped in. He had carried Tinker Bell part of the way, and his hand was still messy with the fairy dust. "Tinker Bell," he called softly, after making sure that the children were asleep. "Tink, where are you?" She was in a jug for the moment. She liked it very much. She had never been in a jug before. A tinkle as lovely as golden bells answered him. It's the fairy language. Tink said that the shadow was in the chest of drawers. Peter jumped at the drawers. He scattered their contents to the floor with both hands. He pulled out his shadow in a moment. Peter thought that when he and his shadow got close together, they would join like drops of water. When they didn't, he was upset. He tried to stick the shadow on with soap, but that also failed. A shudder passed through Peter. He sat on the floor and cried. His sobs woke Wendy, and she sat up in bed. Peter, having learned good manners at fairy parties, rose and bowed to her. "I'm Peter Pan. What is your name?" "Wendy Moira Angela Darling," she said. "Why were you crying?" "I was crying because I can't get my shadow to stick on," he said. "Besides, I wasn't crying." Wendy looked at the shadow. "It must be sewn on." She knelt and sewed the shadow onto Peter's foot. Then she sat on the bed next to him. She said that she would give him a kiss if he liked, but Peter did not know what she meant and held out his hand. Not to hurt his feelings, Wendy gave him a sewing thimble. Peter grinned and dropped an acorn button into her hand as a gift. Wendy put it on a chain and wore it around her neck. Suddenly, a sound came from a corner of the room. A twinkling light tugged on Wendy's hair. Wendy shrieked, Oh, someone's pulling my hair." "That's Tinker Bell, my fairy," said Peter. "I never knew her to be so naughty before." "A fairy?" cried Wendy. "Oh, if only she would let me see her." The light darted around the room quickly, but for just one moment, Wendy saw the fairy come to rest on the cuckoo clock. "I live with the Lost Boys," said Peter. "They're the children who fall out of their carriages when the nurse is looking the other way. If no one finds them in 7 days, they're sent to the Neverlands to live. I'm their captain." "What fun it must be," Wendy said. "Wendy, do come with me. You could tell the boys stories. I'll teach you to fly," Peter added slyly. "You could tuck us in at night. You could darn our clothes and make pockets for us. None of us has any pockets." Of course, she was thrilled. She ran to Michael and John and shook them. "Wake up," she called. "Peter Pan is coming. He's going to teach us to fly and take us to Neverland." John rubbed his eyes. "I say, Peter, can you really fly?" Instead of answering him, Peter flew around the room. "How topping," said John and Michael. "How sweet," cried Wendy. "Yes, I am sweet. Oh, am I sweet," said Peter, forgetting his manners. Then Peter blew some of the fairy dust from his hands on each of them. It had wonderful results. They were all holding on to the bedposts. Bravely, Michael let go first. He did not quite mean to let go, but he did it, and right away he sailed across the room. "I flewed!" he screamed while still in midair. John let go, and then Wendy. They were not nearly so graceful as Peter. Their heads kept bobbing against the ceiling. But there is nothing that feels as good as that. In the meantime, Nana, who was chained up in the yard, sensed danger. She pulled and pulled at the chain until at last she broke it. In another moment, She had burst into the dining room of number 27 and flung up her paws to heaven, her way of begging for help. Mr. and Mrs. Darling knew at once that something bad was happening in their nursery. They rushed into the street. Looking up at the nursery window, they saw that the room was full of light. Most heart-gripping of all, they could see through the curtain 3 little figures in nightgowns moving round and round, not on the floor, but in the air. Not 3 figures, 4! In a hurry, they opened the street door. Will they reach the nursery in time? If so, how delightful for them! For we would all breathe a sigh of relief, but there will be no story if they do. On the other hand, if they are not in time, I promise that it will all come out right in the end. They would have reached the nursery in time, but the little stars were watching them. Once again, the stars blew the window open, and that smallest star of all called out, "Hurry, Peter!" Peter knew that there was not a moment to lose. "Come!" he cried. He soared out at once into the night, followed by John, Michael, and Wendy. Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana rushed into the nursery too late. The birds were flowing. "Second star to the right, and straight on till morning." That, Peter had told Wendy, was the way to Neverland. But even birds, carrying maps and studying them at windy corners, could not have found it with these instructions. Peter, you see, just said anything that came into his head. At first, his companions trusted him completely. They were so happy about flying that they wasted time circling. They circled around church spires or any other tall buildings on the way that took their fancy. John and Michael raced. Michael got a head start. They laughed and laughed. Not so long ago, they had thought they were very great for being able to fly around a room. But how long ago? They were flying over a sea before this thought began to bother Wendy. John thought it was their second sea and third right. Really, they were very sleepy. This was dangerous, for the moment they fell asleep, down they would fall. They could now fly strongly, but they kept bumping into clouds. If Nana had been with them, she would have had a bandage around Michael's forehead by then. Even so, they drew near Neverland and finally sighted those magic shores. "There it is," said Peter calmly. Strange to say, they knew it at once. A million golden arrows were pointing it out, all directed by their friend the sun. He wanted the children to be sure of their way before leaving them for the night. Now it was getting darker every minute. The children had been flying apart. Now they drew close to Peter. Tinker Bell began talking. "She tells me," said Peter, "that the pirates spotted us long ago. They've taken their big gun out. If they see her light, they'll guess that we are near, and they'll fire. If only one of us had a pocket we could carry her in." Then Peter had a happy idea. They could carry her in John's hat. Tink agreed to hide in the hat if it was carried by hand. Wendy took the hat. This, as we shall see, led to trouble. Tinker Bell hated to let Wendy do any favors for her. Suddenly, the pirates fired the big gun at them. When at last the smoke had cleared away again, John and Michael were all alone in the darkness. Peter had been carried by the wind of the shot far out to sea, while Wendy was blown upwards with no one nearer but Tinker Bell. I don't know whether the idea came suddenly to Tink, or whether she had planned it, but she popped out of the hat and began to lead Wendy into trouble. Tink was not all bad. Rather, she was all bad just now. But, on the other hand, sometimes she was all good. Fairies have to be one thing or the other, because being so small, they have room for only one feeling at a time. So she flew back and forth, plainly meaning, "Follow me and all will be well." What else could Wendy do? She called to Peter, John, and Michael, and got only echoes in reply. She didn't know yet that Tink hated her. And so, confused, she followed Tinker Bell. On this very night, the different groups who lived in the Neverland were all outside. The Lost Boys were out to greet their leader. The pirates were out looking for the Lost Boys. The Indians were out looking for the pirates. The beasts were out looking for the Indians. They were all going round and round the island. But they didn't meet because they were all walking at the same speed. All were looking for trouble, except the Lost Boys. They were out looking for Peter. There were 6 Lost Boys. There was Toodles, the sweetest and most bashful, and Nibs, handsome and dashing. There was Slightly, the most stuck up, Curly, the most naughty, and the shy twins, whom no one could tell apart. The boys stepped silently by in a single file and vanished into the gloom. After a pause came the pirates on their track, singing, "Avast belay yo ho heave to, a pirating we go, and if we're parted by a shot, we're surely to meet below." A more wild group was never seen. Among them was the handsome Chaco. His great arms were bare, and he wore 8 earrings in his ears. The pirate behind him has had many bad names. All of them are terrifying to sailors. Behind him is Bill Jukes, every inch of him tattooed. There was Gentleman Starkey and Noodler, whose hands were put on backwards, and the Irish sailor Smee. In the middle of them was Captain James Hook, riding in a wagon drawn by his men. He treated his men like dogs, and like dogs they obeyed him. Captain Hook was the only man whom every pirate on the sea feared. His face was as pale as a dead man's. His black eyebrows were fierce, and his men were very afraid of him. Instead of a right hand, he had an iron hook. His curly hair was coal black. He was never more evil than when he was polite. The perfect way that he spoke, even when he was swearing, showed he was not from the same background as his crew. In many ways, he was the perfect gentleman. He was a man of great courage. It was said that the only thing he was afraid of was the sight of his own blood. In his mouth was a cigar holder with 2 stems. It let him smoke more than 1 cigar at once. His eyes were as blue as the sky, except when he would plunge his hook into someone. Then they would light up with red spots. The grimmest of Hook was his iron claw. Such is the terrible man who is against Peter Pan. Who will win? On the trail of the pirates, walking silently down the warpath, were the Indians of the Pickaninny tribe. They carry tomahawks and knives. Their faces are painted with war paint. They are a very fierce tribe. At their belts hang many scalps, both of boys and of pirates. They move over the twigs and fallen logs silently. At the front, Great Big Little Panther crawled on his hands and knees with his eyes wide open. Bringing up the rear, where there is the most danger, is Princess Tiger Lily. She is the most beautiful of the hunters. Her head is held high. She is the daughter of the chief. There is not a brave in the tribe who doesn't want to marry her, but she keeps them away with her hatchet. The Indians disappeared like shadows. Soon they were followed by lions, tigers, bears, and all kinds of great and small beasts. Then, last of all, came a gigantic crocodile, searching for Captain Hook. You see, in the last fight between Peter Pan and Hook, Peter had cut off the pirate's right hand and thrown it to the crocodile. The crocodile liked the taste so much that he had followed Hook ever since, from sea to sea, from land to land, licking his lips for the rest of the captain. How lucky for Hook that the crocodile had swallowed a clock that went tick, tick, tick inside of its stomach. Whenever Hook heard the sound of ticking, he was warned that the crocodile was near. On this night, all are keeping a sharp lookout in front. None thinks that the danger may be creeping up from behind. The Lost Boys, however, stopping to talk, heard the pirates' nasty song. "Avast belay yo ho heave to, a pirating we go, and if we're parted by a shot, we're surely to meet below." Quick as rabbits, they darted to their snug home under the ground. At this time, Hook and Smee had left the other pirates behind. Hook was again looking through the jungle, hoping to find the home of Peter Pan and the Lost Boys. Tired, Hook sat on a large mushroom. He didn't sit long, though, for he felt strangely warm. "Smee," he said, "this seat is hot." He jumped up. "Odds bobs, hammers and tongs, I'm burning!" The pirates looked at the mushroom and pulled it up. It came away at once. Oddly enough, smoke came from it. "A chimney!" Hook cried. The pirates looked around and saw holes in some of the trees. They had found the way into the Lost Boys' home. Captain Hook and Smee sneaked off to plan how to get even with Peter Pan. One by one, the Lost Boys left their cave to look for Peter. They didn't know that they had been found out. In the sky, they saw what they thought was a great white bird. It was windy. They could hear her tired, sad cry. More clearly came the shrill voice of Tinker Bell. The jealous fairy had stopped acting nice. She was darting at Windy from every direction, pinching her hard. "Hello, Tank!" cried the boys. Toodles had his bow and arrow. When she saw it, Tink rubbed her little hands in glee. She cried out, "Peter wants you to shoot the windy bird!" Thinking that Peter would be pleased, Toodles put his arrow to his bow and fired. Windy fell to the ground with an arrow in her chest. Slightly was the first to speak. "This is no bird," he said in a scared voice. "I think it must be a lady." "And we have killed her," Nibs said hoarsely. "Peter was bringing her to us," Curly said. "A lady to take care of us at last. A mother, and you have killed her," said one of the twins. It was at this sad moment that they heard Peter's crow-like signal. They were standing fearfully around Windy when Peter dropped in front of them. "Good news, boys," he cried. "I have brought a mother for you all at last." "Ah, me," one boy said. Another said, "Oh, what a sad day." They all stood back and let Peter see Windy's body. He knelt and found that the arrow had stuck in the acorn that he had given her. Because she had worn it on a chain around her neck, it had saved her life. Then they told Peter of Tink's crime. "Tinkerbell," he shouted, "I'm your friend no more." He wouldn't speak to her for a whole week. But what to do with Windy in her present weak state of health? "Let us build a house around her," said Peter. They began in a moment. They ran this way and that. While they were at it, who should come by but John and Michael? "Curly," said Peter, "see that these boys help build the house for Windy." "For Windy?" cried John, horrified. Why, she is only a girl." "That," said Curly, "is why we are her servants." "You? Windy's servants?" said John. "Yeah," Peter said. "You too. Away with them." The surprised brothers were dragged away to hammer and bang and carry. Soon, a charming little house was built around Windy. Peter knocked at the door. What the boys were wondering was, would anyone answer the knock? If a lady answered, what would she be like? The door opened, and a lady came out. It was Windy. She looked very surprised, and this was just how they had hoped she would look. Of course, Slightly was the first to get his word in. "Windy lady," he said, "for you we built this house." "A lovely, darling house," Windy said, and these were the very words they had hoped she would say. "And we are your children," cried the twins. Then all went on their knees, and holding out their arms, begged, "Oh, Windy lady, be our mother." "Should I?" Windy said, all shining. "Of course it's very thrilling, but you see, I'm only a girl. I have no real experience." "Oh, that doesn't matter," said Peter. He acted as if he were the only one there who knew all about it, though really, he was the one who knew least. "What we need is just a nice motherly person." "Oh," said Windy, "then I will do my best. Come inside at once, you naughty children. I am sure your feet are damp. Before I put you to bed, I have just time to finish the story of Cinderella." In they went. I don't know how there was room for them, but you can squeeze very tight in Neverland. And that was the first of the many joyous evenings they had with Windy. By and by she tucked them up in the great bed in their cave. She herself slept that night in the little house. Peter kept watch outside with drawn sword. The pirates could be heard far away, and the wolves were on the prowl. After a time, he fell asleep, and some wobbly fairies had to climb over him on their way home from a party. If any of the other boys had blocked the fairies' path that night, they would have played a joke on him. But the fairies just tweaked Peter's nose and passed on. The next day, Peter measured Windy, John, and Michael for their own doors to the cave. How much Windy, John, and Michael grew to love this home. Windy, as the boys' mother, loved to mend and cook and take care of them. One of her greatest joys was making them all take their medicine, which was made of sugar water. The cave was one large room. On the floor grew big mushrooms that were used as stools. A never tree tried hard to grow in the center of the room. Every morning they sawed the trunk, though, level with the floor. By tea time, it was always about 2 feet high. Then they would put a door on top of it and use it for a table. As soon as they cleared the dishes away, they sawed off the trunk again. Then there was more room to play. There was also a huge fireplace and a bed that tilted against the wall by day. It was let down at 6:30 when it was time to go to sleep. All of the boys slept in it except Michael. Because he was the littlest, he slept in a basket. It was rough and simple, like what baby bears would have. There was one hole in the wall, however, which was no larger than a bird cage. This was Tinkerbell's room. No woman could have had a more beautiful room. Tink was very scornful of the rest of the house. Her bedroom, though, looked rather like it had its nose turned up in the air. Adventures, of course, happened daily. There were fierce battles with the Indians and fights with the pirates, and there were marvelous times with the animals of Neverland. To tell them all would need a very large book. Perhaps it would be best to tell you, though, of the adventure in the lagoon. It had very nice results. If you shut your eyes and are a lucky one, you may see at times a pool of lovely pale colors in the darkness. Then, if you squeeze your eyes tighter, the pool begins to take shape. The colors become so bright that with another squeeze, they would seem to go on fire. But just then you see the lagoon. It's only for one heavenly moment. But if there could be 2 moments, you might see the surf and hear the mermaids singing. The children often spent their days in the lagoon. They swam or played games in the water. Often on sunny days after rain, the mermaids would come in large numbers to play with the bubbles of rainbow water. They would treat them as balls, hitting them gaily from one to another until they burst. It was quite a pretty sight. But whenever the children, except for Peter, who chatted with them by the hour, tried to join in, the mermaids swam away. It was one such day. They were all resting on Marooner's Rock. The boys were dozing, but Peter could sniff danger even in his sleep. Suddenly he sprang to his feet. With a warning cry, he woke the others. "Pirates!" he cried. "Dive!" At once there was a gleam of legs, and the lagoon seemed deserted. A boat drew near. It was the pirates' rowboat, and it had 3 people in it. Smee, Starkey, and the third, a captive. It was none other than Tiger Lily. Her hands and ankles were tied. She knew what was to be her fate. She was to be left on Marooner's Rock to drown. When the tide came in, the rock would be covered with water, and she would drown. Yet her face was brave. She was the daughter of a chief, so she must die as a chief's daughter, proudly and without remorse. The 2 pirates landed the rowboat on the rock and lifted Tiger Lily onto it. She was too proud to beg for her life. Quite near the rock, but out of sight, 2 heads were bobbing up and down. One was Peter's, and the other was Wendy's. Peter planned to save Tiger Lily. He copied the voice of Captain Hook. "Ahoy there, you lubbers!" he called. It was a wonderful job. "The captain!" said Smee. "He must be swimming here," Starkey said. "We are putting the Indian on the rock, Captain," he called out. "Set her free," came the surprising answer. "Cut her bonds and let her go. At once, do you hear?" cried Peter, "or I'll plunge my hook in you." "Aye, aye, Captain," said Smee, puzzled. He cut Tiger Lily's bonds. At once she slid off the rock and swam away as quickly as an eel. A few moments later, the words, "Boat ahoy!" rang over the lagoon in Hook's voice. This time it was not Peter who had spoken. The real Captain Hook was coming through the water. In the light of the boat's lantern, Wendy saw his hook grip the boat's side. Wendy saw Hook's evil face as he rose dripping from the water. She would have liked to swim away, but Peter would not budge. "Where is the Indian?" asked Hook. "We let her go, as you ordered," said Smee. "I gave no such order," thundered the angry Hook. His face was red with rage. He thought for a moment. "Spirit who haunts this dark lagoon tonight," cried Hook. "Who are you?" Of course, Peter should have kept quiet, but he didn't. "I am Peter Pan," he cried. "Now we have him," cried Hook. "Get ready to fight, Smee. Starkey, mind the boat. Take him, dead or alive." Hook leapt into the water. Quickly, Peter cried for the Lost Boys to attack. The fight was short and sharp. Smee and Starkey fought back quite fiercely. Then they dove into the water and swam toward their ship. Peter, meanwhile, was looking for the captain. Strangely, it was not in the water that they met. Hook had climbed onto Marooner's Rock. Peter went up it on the other side. The rock was wet, and each, filling for a grip, met the other's arm. Neither knew that the other was coming. In surprise, they raised their heads. Their faces were almost touching. Quickly, Peter snatched the knife from Hook's belt. He was about to drive it home when he saw that he was higher up on the rock than his enemy. Peter then knew it was not a fair fight. Instead, he gave the pirate a hand to help him up. It was then that Hook bit him. Not the pain of this, but its unfairness was what dazed Peter. Every child is shocked the first time he is treated unfairly. After someone has been unfair to him, he will never be quite the same. No one gets over their first unfairness, no one except Peter. He had often met unfairness, but he always forgot it. I suppose that is the difference between Peter Pan and most children. So when Hook clawed him, it was like the first time he had met unfairness. He stared, horrified, unable to move. Twice Hook clawed Peter with his iron hand. A few minutes later, the other boys saw Hook in the water, swimming wildly for his ship. The crocodile was eagerly chasing him. The lost boys cheered and started for home. They felt certain that Peter and Wendy would meet them there. They even laughed, for they knew that they would be late for bed. In the stillness of the lagoon, there came a feeble cry for help. Peter lay on the rock with Wendy. Both were too weak to swim or fly to the shore. The tide was rising and would soon drown them. "Wendy," he said, "I can neither swim nor fly. Hook has wounded me." The two were almost ready to give up, when suddenly the tail of a kite that Michael had made brushed against Peter, as light as a kiss. It stayed there, as if saying timidly, "Can I be of any use?" Peter seized the tail and tied it around Wendy's waist. She held on to him. She would not go without him. But with a "Goodbye, Wendy," he pushed her from the rock. In a few minutes, she was carried out of his sight. Peter was alone on the lagoon. The rock was very small now. Soon it would be under water. Quickly the waters rose till they were touching his feet. To pass the time until he drowned, he watched the only thing moving on the lagoon. It was the Never Bird, pushing her nest into the water to save him. Peter had, in the past, stopped the Lost Boys from teasing her. The nest floated very well. Before climbing on, Peter carefully placed her eggs inside Mr. Starkey's hat, which had fallen off in the fight. The Never Bird screamed her joy at how clever Peter was. Alas, he crowed his agreement with her. "Arr, arr, arr!" He was not very modest. After that adventure, the Indians and Peter were friends. There was nothing that Tiger Lily and her tribe would not do for them. Peter liked this a bit more than was good for him. He thought he deserved it for being so brave. We have now come to the evening that was to be known as the Night of Nights. That was because of its adventures. Peter and Wendy were playing mother and father to the Lost Boys when Peter asked, "Wendy, it is only make-believe that I am their father, isn't it? You see, it would make me seem so old to be their real father." "If you wish it," she replied, and she was sure that she heard his sigh of relief. "Peter, what are your exact feelings toward me?" she asked. "Those of a loving son, Wendy." "I thought so," said Wendy. She then sat by herself at the other end of the room. "You are so strange," he said, frankly puzzled. "And Tiger Lily is just the same. There's something she wants to be to me, and she says it is not my mother." "What is it?" he asked. "That's not for a lady to tell," said Wendy. "Then I will ask Tinker Bell," Peter said. "Oh, yes, Tinker Bell will tell you," Wendy said scornfully. "She is an abandoned little creature." Here, Tink, who was in her bedroom, squeaked out something nasty. "She says she glories in being abandoned," translated Peter. An idea came to him. "Perhaps Tink wants to be my mother." "You silly fool!" cried Tinker Bell angrily. "I almost agree with her," Wendy snapped. Fancy Wendy snapping. But then she had been very much put upon. She also didn't know what was to happen before the night was over. Talking about mothers, though, brought Wendy, John, and Michael to think that they missed home very much. They made up their minds to go home at once. Wendy offered to bring all of the Lost Boys home for the darlings to adopt. Each of the boys said yes, except Peter. "If you find your mothers," he said darkly, "I hope you will like them." "Tink, lead the way for 'em," said Peter. Tink darted up the nearest tree door. No one followed her, for at that moment the pirates made their dreadful attack on the Indians. For the Indians had been guarding the boys' underground home. They were thinking of what they would do when they had beaten the pirates, but when the pirates found them, the Indians knew that they would be beaten. Around the brave Tiger Lily were 24 of her strongest fighters. They grabbed their weapons, and the air was filled with war cries, but it was too late. Many of the Pickaninny tribe were sent to their happy hunting grounds. It was not only the Indians who died in that fight. With the Indian Lean Wolf fell the pirate Alf Mason. He would sail the Spanish Main no more. Many of the pirates who fought that night met the arrows and tomahawks of the Pickaninny tribe. Panther, Tiger Lily, and the few other Indians lived to cut their way through the pirates and went into the forest. The battle above had been heard by the children. They crowded around Peter in terror. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise above stopped. "If the Indians have won," Peter said, "they will beat the tom-tom. It is always their sign of victory." Above, Hook was listening. He told Smee to beat the tom-tom that the Indians had left behind. Twice Smee beat upon the tom-tom, and then stopped to listen gleefully. "The tom-tom!" the pirates heard Peter cry. "An Indian victory!" The children answered with a cheer that was music to the wicked hearts above. The children got ready to go home. The first to come out from his tree was Curly. He was quickly grabbed by the pirates, bound and gagged. Each of the boys got the same mean treatment as they came out of their tree hollows. A different treatment was given to Windy, who came out last. With phony politeness, Hook raised his hat to her. Offering her his arm, he took her to the spot where the others were being gagged. He did it in such a way that she was too fascinated to cry out. She was only a little girl. Hook ordered the children put onto his ship. Now he was alone in the darkening night. He let his cloak slip softly to the ground. Then, biting his lips, he stepped into one of the tree entrances to the cave. Silently, he slid down to the foot of the shaft. As his eyes got used to the dim light, his greedy gaze rested on the bed where Peter Pan lay fast asleep. Not knowing what went on above, Peter had played cheerfully on his pipes in a sad try to prove to himself that he didn't care. Then he chose to not take his medicine so as to upset Windy. Then he nearly cried. But then he thought that she would be more unhappy if he laughed instead. He laughed a silly laugh and fell asleep in the middle of it. As the captain stared at Peter, he saw the untouched medicine. From his pocket he took a terrible poison that he had mixed himself. He added it to the medicine. Then, with one long gloating look upon his victim, he turned and wormed his way up the tree. Peter slept on. Some time later, Tinker Bell flew in. Her face was red and her dress was stained. Waking Peter, she told him of the night's events. "The Indians lost? Windy and the boys taken by the pirates? I'll rescue her! I'll rescue her!" cried Peter. Then he thought of what he could do to please Windy. He would take his medicine. His hand closed on the fatal drink. "No!" shrieked Tinker Bell. She had heard Hook's laughing about his deed as he sped through the woods. "Don't be silly, Tink." He raised the cup to his lips. No time for words now. A time for deeds. With one of her lightning movements, Tink got between his lips and the cup, and she drank it all. Right away, she began to stagger in the air. "What's the matter with you?" cried Peter. "It was poisoned, Peter," she told him softly. "Now I'm going to be dead." Her wings could scarcely carry her now. She landed on his shoulder and whispered to him. She spoke quite low. At first he could not hear what she said. She was saying that she thought she could get well again if children believed in fairies. Peter flung out his arms to all the children who were dreaming at this time of the Neverland. "Do you believe?" he cried out. Do you believe? If you believe, clap your hands. Don't let Tinker Bell die. Please clap your hands, clap your hands, clap your hands." Tink sat straight up to listen to her fate. Many children clapped. Some didn't. A few of the little beasts even hissed. But the clapping children saved Tink. Fairies can't live unless someone believes in them. Soon she was flashing through the room, more merry and full of tricks than ever. Tink never thought of thanking those children who believed, but she would have loved to get at the ones who had hissed. "And now to rescue Wendy," said Peter, and then he swore this dark oath. "Hook or me this time." Darting through the moonlit trees, his knife at his side, he set out on his quest. He was quite happy. There was one green light flashing on the water near the mouth of the Pirate River. It marked where the ship, the Jolly Roger, lay low in the water. It was a spooky-looking craft, dirty to the hull. She was the man-eater of the seas, wrapped in the blanket of night. Hook walked the deck in thought, for it was the captain's hour of triumph. Peter had been removed forever from his path, and all the other boys were on the ship, about to walk the plank. It was his nastiest deed ever. Why, then, was he so unhappy? It was because he was so very alone. This sad man never felt more alone than when he was surrounded by his men. They were all so much rougher than he was. You see, Hook was not his true name. Hook, unlike his men, came from a very good family. Above all, he still kept the love for good manners learned at his expensive school. To him, good manners mattered greatly. Now, he realized, because of his bad deeds, no little children loved him. Do not envy the unhappy Captain Hook. John, Michael, and the Lost Boys were dragged from the hold and put in line in front of Hook.
"You, boy, you look brave," Hook said to John. "Would you like to join my men?"
Well, John had sometimes thought of being a pirate when he was doing math problems. He was also thrilled by Hook picking him out. "I once thought of calling myself Red-Handed Jack," he said.
"And a good name, too. We'll call you that here, boy, if you join."
"What would you call me?" piped up Michael.
"Blackbeard Joe."
Michael was impressed. "Would we still be loyal subjects of the king?" asked John.
Through Hook's teeth came the answer. "You would have to swear. Down with the king."
Perhaps John had not behaved very well so far as a child, but he shone out now. "Then I will not," he cried. "I won't either," squeaked Michael.
Hook roared out, "That seals your doom. Bring up the mother. Get the plank ready."
They were only boys, but they tried to look brave as Wendy was brought up and tied to the mast.
"So, my beauty," said Hook as if he spoke in sugar, "you are to see your children walk the plank. Have you any last words?"
At this moment, Wendy was grand. "Dear boys," she said firmly, "I feel that I have a message to you from your real mothers, and it is this. We hope our sons will die like English gentlemen." Even the pirates were awed. Hook smiled on them with his teeth ground. He took a step toward Wendy, but he never reached her. He never heard her cry over the boy's fate. He heard something else instead. It was the terrible tick, 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 tick of the crocodile. The sound came closer and closer, as if the crocodile were about to board the ship.
Hide me, please, someone hide me," begged Hook.
While the crew gathered around him, the boys rushed to the ship's side to see. Then they got the strangest surprise of this night of nights. It was no crocodile that was coming to their aid. It was Peter! An odd thing had happened as Peter made his way to the ship. He had passed the crocodile and noticed that the clock had run down. Thinking about it, he decided to tick so that the other animals would think he was the crocodile and let him pass safely. When he reached the ship, he realized that the ticking would allow him to board without being caught. "How clever of me!" he crowed to himself. Now the crocodile followed him. As silently as a mouse, Peter climbed the ship's side. He waved to the boys not to burst into cheers. Then, with every inch of him on tiptoe, Peter slipped into the cabin. He found weapons for his boys. With sword drawn, he called out to Hook, "Dark and evil man, let us fight!"
"Proud and bold child," said Hook, "prepare to meet thy doom."
Without more words, they began to fight. Peter and Hook fought very hard. The captain swung his hook sharply, but Peter dodged under it. Then Peter got him in the ribs. The sword fell from Hook's hand, and he was at Peter's mercy. With a bow, Peter invited Hook to pick up his sword. Hook did so right away, but with a sad feeling that Peter was showing good manners. A dark thought came into his mind.
"It's some fiend fighting me. Pan, who and what art thou?" he cried.
"I'm youth, I'm joy," Peter sang out. "I'm a little bird that is broken out of the egg." This, of course, was nonsense, but it was proof to the unhappy Hook that Peter did not know at all who or what he was. This Hook thought to be the best of good manners.
"Do it again,"
he cried sadly. Peter danced around him as if the wind blew him out of danger. Again and again he pricked. Hook was fighting now without hope. He no longer asked for life, but his heart wanted one thing: to see Peter use bad manners before it was cold forever. Seeing Peter coming at him, Hook sprang upon the side of the ship to throw himself into the sea. He did not care that the crocodile was waiting for him. As he looked at Peter, he invited him with a wave to use his foot. It made Peter kick instead of stab. At last, Hook got the upper hand that he wanted so much.
"Bad manners,"
he cried jeeringly, and went content to the crocodile. Thus died Captain Hook. When it was all over, Wendy thanked them all. Then she pointed to Hook's watch, which was hung on a nail. It said 1:30. The lateness of the hour was almost the biggest thing of all. She got them to bed in the pirates' bunks pretty quickly, you may be sure. But Peter walked up and down on the deck until at last he fell asleep. He had one of his bad dreams that night. Wendy held him tight and made her plans to fly home. Instead of watching the ship, however, we must now return to the children's home. The children's beds are made, and look, the window is open. Mrs. Darling was playing Home Sweet Home on the piano. She was longing for her children. If we had returned sooner, she would have probably cried at us, "What do I matter? Go back and keep an eye on the children." That's what mothers are like. Strangely enough, it was Peter and Tinker Bell who flew to the window first. Peter's words tell all.
"Quick, Tink," he whispered. "Close the window. Bar it. When Wendy comes back, she will think her mother locked the window. She will have to come back to the Neverland with me."
He peeped inside. Tears were in Mrs. Darling's eyes, and she stopped playing the piano. "Oh, all right," he said at last. He unbarred the window.
"Come on, Tink. We don't want any silly mothers anyway,"
he sneered, and they flew away. Thus Wendy, John, and Michael found the window open for them after all. I think it was more than they deserved. Michael looked all around him. "John," he said, "I think I have been here before." "Of course you have, silly. There is your old bed." "It is very careless of Mother," continued that bad little boy, "not to be here when we got back." They peeked into the dog's kennel and found Father asleep inside. Poor Father! When the children flew away, Mr. Darling felt in his bones that all the blame was his because he had chained Nana up. He felt so bad that he had changed places with her. It was then that Mrs. Darling began playing again. "It's Mother!" exclaimed Wendy. "Then you are not really our mother, Wendy?" asked Michael. "Oh dear!" cried Wendy. "It is about time we came back." She realized that they must break the happy news of the return gently to Mrs. Darling. They crept into their beds, and when Mother looked into the nursery again, all the beds were filled. "George! Nana!" she called when she could speak. Mr. Darling and Nana came rushing into the room to share her joy. It was a lovely sight, but there was none to see it except a little boy who was staring in at the window. He had many pleasures that other children can never know, but Peter was looking through the window at the one joy that he could never have. The Darlings adopted the lost boys. Mr. Darling said they would fit in, and Mrs. Darling promised Peter that Wendy could visit him every year. Wendy waited for Peter's return. He didn't come for her until 2 years had passed. Although they had had a grand time, the funny thing was that he didn't know that he had missed a year. That was the last time the girl Wendy ever saw Peter. For a little longer, she tried not to have growing pains. She felt she was untrue to him when she did. Even so, the years rolled on without bringing Peter. When they met again, Wendy was a married woman with a little girl of her own, named Jane. One night, as Jane lay asleep, Wendy sat sewing in the very same nursery. The window blew open, and Peter flew in. He had not changed at all. "Hello, Wendy," he said, not seeing any change. Wendy looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Peter," she said, "I cannot fly with you any more. I am ever so much more than 20. I grew up long ago." Peter looked horrified. He sat down on the floor, sobbing. Poor Wendy ran out of the room to try and think. Jane, however, who always asked questions, woke up. She sat up in bed, very interested. "Boy," she said, "why are you crying?" When Wendy returned to the nursery, she found Peter sitting on the bedpost. He was crowing loudly. Jane, in her nightie, was flying around the room. In the end, of course, Wendy let them fly away together. Our last look of her shows her at the window, watching Peter and Jane until they were as small as stars. And so it will continue with Jane's daughter and her daughter and her daughter forevermore. It will last so long as children are happy, innocent, and heartless. And that concludes the timeless tale of Peter Pan by Sir James Matthew Barrie, 1st Baronet.